My name is Diana, and the story I am about to tell you. The family never wanted it told. There is a particular kind of silence in a house after someone dies, not the silence of an empty room. That is simply absence, and absence has its own texture. I mean, the silence that descends when the person who held everything together has finally let go, and the weight of everything they held redistributes itself over the people who remain. And for a moment, just a moment, before the practical things begin and the larger questions surface, everything waits. Everything is suspended. The house holds its breath. Margaret Calloway knew that silence well by the time she was 47. She had sat inside it 3 times. When her grandfather died, when her father died 12 years after him, and finally, on a gray Tuesday morning in November in the West, Riding of Yorkshire, when her grandmother Dorothy passed quietly in the early hours. Dorothy had been 81. She passed the way she had done most things in her life, without drama, without drawing attention to herself, having apparently decided the time had come, and acting on that decision with the same quiet efficiency she had brought to every other decision across 8 decades. Margaret had been in the house when it happened. She was always the one in the house. That is the first thing you need to understand about this story, and everything else in it depends on it. She called the doctor. She called the funeral home. She called her brothers, Patrick in Edinburgh, James in Bristol, and told them what had happened and gave them the practical information they needed. Then she put the kettle on, because it was 5:30 in the morning and it was November, and there was simply nothing else to do. And she sat at Dorothy's kitchen table with a cup of tea she barely touched and listened to the house be quiet in a way it would never quite recover from. Patrick arrived the following afternoon with his wife Karen, organized and already mentally processing what needed to happen. James arrived the morning after with his wife Lynn, softer in manner but already several conversations behind the one Patrick had been having in his own head since the phone call. They arrived at the house on Millfield Lane, a 3-bedroom Victorian terrace in a quiet street in the West Riding, a house that smelled of old books and good tea and the specific mixture of lavender and wool that Margaret had always associated with her grandmother. And they kissed each other on the cheeks and said the right things about how peaceful it had been, how she had had a good, long life, how she would have wanted it this way. And then, over the first evening, something began to emerge from underneath the collective grief. Not immediately, not with any particular rudeness, but unmistakably. The way a tide begins to come in before most people notice it. A conversation about the house, about the estate, about what was sensible and practical and what the logical timeline would look like. Patrick had been doing some research, he said, and he thought they should understand the process as soon as possible because these things moved more quickly when you were prepared. He said this carefully with the air of a man who believes he is being reasonable. Margaret, sitting across the kitchen table from him and listening to the particular precision of his language, understood that the research had not been done in the previous 24 hours. Patrick had been thinking about this for longer than Dorothy had been dead. She didn't say that. She listened. She noted it. Margaret was a district nurse and had been for 23 years. She drove a Navy Renault with a bag in the back containing everything she needed to keep people comfortable in their own homes, their medications organized correctly, their pressure ulcers dressed, their pain managed, their dignity maintained in the particular way that takes skill and patience and a specific quality of presence that cannot be taught, only developed. She covered a wide stretch of the West Riding. Her patients range from middle-aged people managing complex chronic illness to very old people in the final chapter of things. She had been present at the deaths of 41 people in her professional career. She had held hands and adjusted pillows and spoken the quiet, true things that need to be said in those rooms. She was practical and observant and not frightened of difficult things. She had, over 23 years, developed the specific quality of steadiness that comes from being regularly present at moments when steadiness is the most important thing a person can offer. Her patients described her to her manager as calming. Margaret would have described herself differently. She was simply not frightened of what was difficult. For 11 years, she had brought that quality to her grandmother's door. It had started gradually, the way these things start. Dorothy had been sharp well into her mid-70s, fiercely so, with the particular intellectual precision of someone who had read widely and formed opinions she could defend with care. She had been a librarian's assistant before she married, had continued reading with the devotion of someone who understands that reading is not a pastime, but a discipline, and she had opinions about novels and politics and the behavior of people that she delivered with a dry directness that Margaret had always found bracing and honest. Dorothy did not perform warmth. She simply had it, in a very specific and not general way, and the people she had it for knew it without needing it to be demonstrated. In her mid-70s, the small things began to slip, appointments forgotten, medications taken twice, or not at all. A near fall on the stairs that she didn't mention until Margaret noticed the bruise on her wrist 10 days later. Margaret, who knew what early cognitive aging looked like, and who had been watching for the signs the way caregivers watch, peripherally, attentively, hoping to be wrong, understood what she was seeing and understood what it meant. She began coming more regularly, once a week, then twice, then the Wednesday afternoon check-in that became as much a fixture as anything else in her schedule. She organized the medication management system. The pill organizer with the day labels checked and refilled each Wednesday, documented in a small notebook she kept in the kitchen drawer. She arranged the twice-weekly visit from a home care assistant, interviewing 3 candidates before finding one whose manner with Dorothy was right. Not condescending, not breezy, not performatively cheerful in the way that older people sometimes find exhausting, just steady and respectful. She coordinated with Dorothy's GP, a capable young woman named Dr. Peterson, who had joined the practice 4 years into Margaret's involvement and who quickly learned to treat Margaret's clinical assessments as seriously as she treated her own. When Dorothy needed a procedure in her late 70s, a gallbladder issue that required a hospital stay, it was Margaret who drove her to Leeds, who sat in the waiting area for 6 hours, who spoke to the surgical team and asked the questions that needed asking, who read the discharge instructions carefully and made sure Dorothy understood them when they got home. When Dorothy developed a urinary tract infection in her early 80s that produced a week of significant confusion, frightening for Dorothy, who was sharp enough to be aware of her own unsharpness, which made it worse. It was Margaret who stayed for 3 nights in the spare room until the antibiotics had worked, and Dorothy was herself again, or nearly. That was the week that something shifted between them. Dorothy had been frightened in a way she hadn't been since she was young, and Margaret had been there for it, had managed it practically, and sat through the nights of it and been present in the specific way that was not just competence, but company. Afterward, Dorothy had said simply, "You didn't have to do that." And Margaret had said, "Yes, I did." And Dorothy had looked at her for a moment with the directness she reserved for the things that mattered, and hadn't said anything else. But Margaret had understood from that look that it had been received. The Sunday visits had started that winter. Not check-ins, something more. Afternoons, 2, sometimes 3 hours at the kitchen table with tea and the biscuits Dorothy kept in a tin with a painting of the Yorkshire dales on the lid. Dorothy talked. She had a great deal she had been saving up to say, Margaret discovered. Observations about people and places and the particular shapes that lives take, stored up over 80 years of watching things carefully and keeping most of her thoughts to herself. She was funny, which Margaret had always known abstractly and now discovered in specifics. She was also, in those afternoons, increasingly willing to say the honest thing rather than the polite one, which Margaret recognized as a quality that tended to arrive in people when they were old enough to have stopped needing to manage how they were perceived. Patrick visited at Christmas. He had done so reliably for as long as Margaret could remember, and she did not fault him for it. He had a life in Edinburgh, a demanding one with a good career and his own family responsibilities and the genuine logistical difficulty of distance. He came at Christmas. He called on Dorothy's birthday and sometimes on the anniversary of their grandfather's death. He sent cards at Easter. He was not a bad grandson. He was a grandson whose love for Dorothy existed at a certain managed distance, and who had constructed, over the years of Margaret's increasing involvement, a comfortable understanding of the situation in which everything was clearly being handled, and he could therefore remain at the distance that suited him. James lived 20 minutes away, which confused people when they heard it. 20 minutes is nothing. 20 minutes should have meant visits, regular ones, the kind of presence that geography enables. In James's case, it had meant phone calls instead, which he believed were roughly equivalent and which were not. He had a busy household, 2 teenage children, a wife whose own parents had health issues and required attention, a logistics management job with irregular hours. When he thought about Dorothy, he thought of her as being fine, largely because Margaret's management of everything meant that Dorothy presented as fine to anyone who called and asked. She said she was very well when people called. She was of the generation that said this regardless of the underlying reality, and the people who called, her son James, occasionally Patrick from Edinburgh, heard it and were reassured by it and did not press further. Margaret never told either of them what the Wednesday afternoons were like. Not the falls she had intercepted. Not the nights the medication had gone wrong. Not the afternoon she had arrived to find Dorothy sitting at the kitchen table in the half-dark, not quite sure what day it was, in a way that had lasted 20 minutes and resolved completely, but that had told Margaret something important about where things were heading. She had not reported these things because they were not hers to report, and because Dorothy had not asked her to. She had simply been there and managed them and carried on. The will reading took place on a Wednesday afternoon in Harrogate. The solicitor's office was in a building that had housed legal practices since before the war, with the smell of accumulated formality, old carpet and dry central heating, and the faint ghost of decades of difficult conversations. Bernard, the solicitor, had known Dorothy for 22 years. He was a careful man who chose his words with the precision of someone who understood that, in these rooms, precision was a form of kindness, and that the most important thing he could do was say what he had to say clearly and then give the people in front of him the space to respond. He read the standard provisions first. The house on Millfield Lane, to be sold, proceeds divided equally among all 3 grandchildren. Patrick nodded, the nod of a man who has done arithmetic beforehand and confirmed it. The Halifax savings account, the one they all knew about, also divided 3 ways. James looked relieved, which told Margaret something about the conversation he had been having with himself since the phone call. Then Bernard paused. He set down the pages he had been reading from. He picked up a different section of the folder, a section with a blue paper clip where the others had red ones. And he said, in a tone that was careful without being dramatic, "There is also a trust." He said it simply, and he let the sentence sit. None of them had known about it. Dorothy had established the trust 16 years earlier through a different firm in Leeds. She had funded it from a combination of an inheritance received from her own mother, an amount the family had known about vaguely, and had long since stopped thinking of as significant, and a portfolio of investments that she had managed quietly through a financial advisor at the Leeds firm for over 20 years. She had never mentioned the portfolio to any of them. She had gone on living in the terraced house on Millfield Lane, driving the same small car, wearing the same practical coats, eating the same simple meals, giving no indication that she was building anything. The portfolio had grown. The trust had grown with it. By the time Dorothy died, it was considerably more than any of them had anticipated, because none of them had ever had reason to think carefully about what Dorothy might actually have accumulated over a lifetime of working and saving and spending very little on herself. The trust named one beneficiary, Margaret. The room didn't go loud, it went still, which is a different thing and, in some ways, harder. Patrick's face went through 3 expressions in rapid sequence: surprise, calculation, and then the particular composure of a man who has located the appropriate response and is applying it deliberately. James simply said, with genuine bewilderment, "I don't understand." He said it as a factual observation. Bernard confirmed the trust was valid. He confirmed the amount. He confirmed that the documents from the Leeds firm were in order, and then he produced a sealed envelope from the folder, white, with all 3 of their names written on it in Dorothy's handwriting, and slid it across the table. Margaret opened it. Her hands were not quite steady. The others watched her face. Dorothy's handwriting was small and slightly cramped, as it had been in her last 2 years when arthritis had made the pen effortful. The letter was 1 page. Dorothy had always preferred speaking to writing, and the brevity of the letter showed a kind of discipline. She had written only what she needed to say, which meant that every sentence had been chosen. She wrote, "I want to explain this to all 3 of you before anything else, because I know how it will look, and I am asking you to trust that it is not what it looks like. I am not punishing Patrick or James. I have loved you both since before you were born, in the particular fierce way of someone who loves a person before they know who that person will become, and I love you still." She wrote, "But I am 81 years old, and I have spent a great deal of my life staying quiet in order to keep the peace between people I loved. I did this for a long time, and I am not sure I was always right to do it. Silence in the service of peace is sometimes a kindness. It is also sometimes a cowardice, and I am no longer sure I can always tell the difference. What I can tell is that I am done with it. Not because I am angry, I am not angry. Because I think that honesty, even the expensive kind, is a form of love, and it is one I have underused." She wrote, "Margaret has driven me to every appointment for 11 years. She has sat in hospital waiting rooms for hours at a time. She organized my medication, coordinated my care, managed the things I could no longer manage, and she did all of it without making me feel like a burden, which is the hardest thing to do for a person who has been independent her whole life and who finds dependency frightening. She has come every Sunday, and she has stayed and talked with me and listened, and she has done this because she could not imagine not doing it, not because she expected anything from me in return. I know the difference between those 2 things. I have had 81 years to learn it." She wrote, The house and the savings are for all three of you equally, because they should be. And because I mean what I said about not punishing anyone. But this is for the one who was actually here. I hope you will understand. In time, I love you all. I am sorry I waited so long to be this honest. James made a sound that was almost language and wasn't quite. Patrick said, after a long silence, in the voice he used when he was being precise about something, "We need to understand what our options are here." Margaret said, "I understand." They gathered their things. They thanked Bernard. They drove back to Millfield Lane and made dinner in the kitchen with the careful, overly polite maneuvering of people who have a great deal to say and have agreed, without saying so, to defer it. It came out over the following weeks, piece by piece. Patrick called first, 5 days after the reading. He had engaged a solicitor of his own, a man in Edinburgh who specialized in contested estates, which told Margaret that Patrick had been researching his options since before the Harrogate appointment. He wanted to discuss, Patrick said carefully, the question of capacity, the circumstances under which the trust had been established. Dorothy's mental capacity 16 years ago when the trust was created, and the question of whether, in the years since, the nature of Margaret's involvement in Dorothy's daily life had constituted what he referred to, in the precise legal phrasing of someone who has been briefed by a specialist, undue influence. Margaret had been a district nurse for 23 years. Undue influence in the context of elder care and estate disputes was a term she had encountered in professional training, in legal updates, in the specific safeguarding context of her work. She knew what it meant. She also knew what it was being applied to. She said, "Patrick, I need you to hear what you are saying." He said he wasn't saying anything. He was asking about options. She said, "You are asking whether I manipulated our grandmother into leaving me money. That is what undue influence means in this context. Call it what it is." He said, "I'm being practical." She said, "I would like future communications about this to go through my solicitor." Her solicitor was Frances, a woman in Harrogate with a plain-spoken manner and the quiet, practical kindness of someone who has seen a great many families discover, in the context of grief and inheritance, who they actually are. Margaret came to Frances with everything she had, and Frances listened without interruption, and then she asked, "What do you have documented?" What Margaret had documented was quite a lot, and not because she had been building a file in anticipation of this. She had been building it because documentation was simply how she worked. You kept care records, you noted conversations with doctors, you recorded medication changes and the dates of appointments and what the outcomes were. Because accuracy in nursing was not optional, because the difference between a good care record and a poor one could be the difference between catching a deterioration early and missing it entirely. She had 11 years of that kind of careful, habitual record. Most of it was clinical. Some of it was simply the record of a person who had been responsible for another person's well-being for a long time and had kept track accordingly. She also had something else, found while sorting through Dorothy's home office. She had been looking for insurance documents, the ordinary administrative work of an estate, and the desk drawer had been slightly jammed, and when she got it open, a stack of statements had fallen forward, not from the Leeds Trust. Financial statements from Dorothy's ordinary accounts with a small handwritten ledger tucked beneath them. A green notebook, the kind used for household accounts. Dorothy's writing, small and careful, covering the last 15 years. She read it carefully. The ledger contained, among other things, records of 2 loans. The first, 14 years ago, Patrick had borrowed £14,000 from Dorothy. There was a handwritten note documenting it, with a date and an amount, And the purpose? A period of financial difficulty in his business. And Patrick's signature at the bottom. Margaret looked at Patrick's signature for a long time. She had not known about this loan. It had never been mentioned. The ledger showed no record of any repayment in any amount across 14 years. The second, 7 years ago, James had borrowed £8,000, also documented in the same careful ledger, with a date and James's signature. Also unreturned, Margaret herself had borrowed nothing from Dorothy, not in 47 years. She had, in the last 3 years of Dorothy's life, paid certain household expenses from her own account when they needed doing, and the care funding timeline had not caught up. A boiler repair in February, a grocery order when the care assistant called in sick, heating oil during an especially cold week when Dorothy's supply ran unexpectedly low. She had never kept receipts for these because it had never occurred to her to keep them, because she had not been doing them with any expectation of accounting. She brought the ledger and the statements and her nursing records and 11 years of care documentation to Frances. She brought the letters Dorothy had sent her over the years. Not many, 9 in total across 11 years, because Dorothy preferred conversation. But 9 letters over 11 years from a woman who was careful with her words, and each of them showing, in the plain and specific language Dorothy used, the particular regard she had for Margaret, and the particular clarity with which she had understood what Margaret was doing and why. Frances read everything. She said, "Your brothers are not in a strong position." She also said, "They are not in a position to challenge your character with any credibility, given what this shows about their own, not with these loan records, not with 11 years of contemporaneous care documentation, and a letter in your grandmother's own handwriting explaining her reasoning. The challenge has nowhere to go." Patrick filed anyway. 6 weeks after the will reading, the formal contested estate application arrived through Frances's office. Patrick's Edinburgh solicitor argued incapacity, that Dorothy had not been of sound mind when the trust was established 16 years prior, and undue influence, which was the more serious of the two, and the one that implied, without quite stating, that Margaret had used her access and her proximity and her caregiving relationship to steer her grandmother's financial decisions in her own favor. Frances's response was precise and comprehensive. She addressed the capacity argument with the evidence of the trust's establishment date, 16 years prior, when Dorothy had been 65 and in full health, with no documented cognitive concerns, and with the records of Dorothy's subsequent management of the trust through the Leeds firm, showing engagement and instruction consistent with someone of sound mind across the intervening years. She addressed the undue influence argument with the care documentation, the loan records, and Dorothy's letter, which laid out in Dorothy's own words the reasoning for her decision, and showed it to be not a late-life aberration, but a considered and clearly explained choice by a woman who knew exactly what she was doing. She also, in a section that Frances had included not to be punitive but because it was relevant to the integrity of the challenge, appended the ledger entries showing the outstanding loans to both Patrick and James. These had not been mentioned in the challenge documents. Their absence from the challenge framing was, Frances noted, itself informative. The Edinburgh solicitor called Frances 3 weeks after receiving the response. He advised his client, Patrick, that the basis for the challenge had not held up under scrutiny. Patrick withdrew. James had not formally joined the challenge. He had occupied the position, throughout, of the brother who wanted things resolved, which in practice had meant the brother who waited to see what Patrick's outcome would be before deciding whether to commit to anything himself. When the withdrawal came through, James called Margaret. He said he was sorry for how it had all gone. He said it with the particular quality of someone who is genuinely sorry for the consequences of a situation and not entirely certain what his own role in it had been. Margaret thanked him. They talked for 20 minutes about the practical business of the estate, the timeline for the house sale, the sorting of Dorothy's belongings, a few specific items that needed to be allocated before the house was cleared. The conversation was almost normal, almost what it had been before. When it ended, Margaret sat with the phone in her hand and thought, almost. The estate was settled 9 months after Dorothy's death. Margaret received the trust, the sum that she had not known was coming, and that was, when the valuation was finalized, more than she had made in all of her 23 years in nursing combined. She sat with this for a long time. It did not feel like winning. It felt like receiving something that had been set aside for her a long time ago, quietly, in the handwriting of a woman who had decided to be honest from the only position she still had access to. She paid off her mortgage on the semi-detached house she had bought 15 years ago and had been servicing since on a district nurse's salary and the savings of a person who had never spent particularly freely. She made a donation to the hospice charity that had provided specialist support to Dorothy's care team in the final months. She set the rest aside, not because she didn't know what to do with it, but because she thought she should wait until she knew what she wanted, which was the approach Dorothy had always taken with money and which Margaret had now inherited along with everything else. And the house on Millfield Lane was sold. This is the part that she hadn't thought through completely when she agreed to the estate plan. And I want you to understand it precisely, because this is where the cost lives. The house had to be sold. That was Dorothy's specification: equal distribution from the proceeds, because Dorothy had been a woman of genuine fairness, even in her final act of honesty. Margaret had agreed to this. She had understood it legally and agreed to it without reservation. She had not understood it in her body until the estate agent's sign went up and she drove past the house on a Wednesday morning on her way to see a patient and felt something in her chest that was not grief exactly. She had done the grief work, or a significant portion of it, but something more specific and harder to name: the loss of a place rather than a person. The loss of the kitchen with the table by the window, the light on a winter Sunday afternoon, gray and thin and coming through the glass above the sink in a specific way she had been looking at for 11 years, the sound of the kettle, the tin of biscuits with the Yorkshire Dales on the lid, the way Dorothy held her cup with both hands in the later years because her fingers were cold and the warmth of the mug helped them. Someone else's family would repaint those walls. Someone else's children would eat breakfast at that table. The kitchen would become someone else's idea of a kitchen, and the specific texture of what it had been for Dorothy and for the Sunday afternoons would not survive the transaction. This is how houses work. She had known this. Knowing it and feeling it are different things, and she had not known until the sign went up how differently they would feel. Patrick has not called since the withdrawal. Margaret has made what peace with this that she has been able to make, which is the imperfect, functional peace of someone who has accepted that certain things will not change and has stopped waiting for them to. Christmas passes without a call from Edinburgh. She has stopped expecting one and has almost stopped noticing the absence, which is the best you can do with certain kinds of loss. James calls it Christmas. He sent a card for Dorothy's birthday in March of the first year, which Margaret placed on her windowsill for a week and then put away. There is a version of the relationship between them that continues, careful, reduced, The version that survives when the context that supported the fuller one has been damaged in a way that neither party has been able to fully address. She accepts this version for what it is. She still works. The blue Renault, the bag in the back, the Tuesday and Thursday, rounds across the West Riding. She is good at it, and she finds in it the specific satisfaction that comes from doing the right work in the right way over a long enough time that you have stopped needing to think about whether it is the right work. The money changed her security and removed the background low-level financial anxiety that had been a fixture of her adult life for as long as she could remember. It did not change her nature, which had never required changing. She went to the cemetery on Dorothy's birthday in March, as she has every year since. She stood at the grave for a while without saying much in particular. She is not a person who speaks to graves, but she finds it useful to be in their presence sometimes, to stand in the specific quiet of a place where someone you loved is, and let the fact of them settle differently than it does in ordinary life. She carries the letter with her, not literally, not in a pocket, but she carries what it said. I am 81 years old, and I have spent a great deal of my life staying quiet in order to keep the peace. And I have decided that I am done with that. She thinks about those words with some regularity, in the way you think about words that cost someone something to write and were written anyway. It took Dorothy 81 years to put that sentence on paper. Margaret wonders sometimes how many people never manage it at all. How many people die with the honest version still unwritten because the peace they were keeping always seemed more important than the truth they were sitting with. There is something else about those 11 years that I want to tell you, because it belongs to this story and because it goes to the heart of what Dorothy understood and what the letter was trying to say. Margaret had not done those 11 years in a spirit of sacrifice. That is the word people reach for when they hear a story like this. Sacrifice. She gave up her time. She sacrificed her Sundays. She sacrificed her weekends for hospital visits. And, while these things were true in the logistical sense, they were not the whole truth, and Dorothy had understood this better than Margaret had, for most of those years. The truth was that the Sunday afternoons on Millfield Lane were, for a long stretch of that period, some of the best hours of Margaret's week. Dorothy was interesting, genuinely interesting, in the way of people who have lived a great deal and processed most of it honestly and arrived late in life at a set of observations about human nature that are hard-earned and therefore worth hearing. She talked about her own marriage, which had been a good one and a complicated one, and had lasted 39 years before Margaret's grandfather died. And she talked about it without sentiment and without revision, in the flat, honest way of someone who has had enough time to see a thing clearly. She talked about her children, Margaret's father and his sister, with the specific complicated love of a parent who loves their children completely and knows them imperfectly and has made a degree of peace with the gap between the two. She talked about the books she was reading, the ones she still read right up until the last 18 months when her vision had made reading unreliable, and she had opinions that were sometimes surprising and sometimes exactly what Margaret expected and always worth engaging with. She also, in those years, listened to Margaret. This is the part that is hardest to articulate. Dorothy asked questions and listened to the answers. She asked about Margaret's patients, not their names or identifying details, but the texture of the work, what it was like, what it required. She asked about Margaret's own life in the specific way of someone who is genuinely curious about another person, rather than filling conversational space. Margaret was 47 and had been a district nurse for 23 years, and had a sister-in-law she was close to, and friends she saw occasionally, and a life that was, by most measures, a good one. But she was also a person who had spent a great deal of her adult life being the capable one, the steady one, the one who managed things. And in the kitchen on Millfield Lane on Sunday afternoons, she was simply Margaret, which was a rarer thing than it should have been, and which she had valued without quite knowing how much until it was gone. Dorothy had known that. That is what the letter was saying, in between the lines of what it actually said. Not just, I am acknowledging what you did for me, but I knew what you were getting from it too, and I am glad. And I am telling you that the giving and the receiving were both real and both mattered. This is the inheritance that does not appear on the trust document. This is the thing the money cannot contain. Patrick has his version of those 11 years. It is a version in which Margaret was present because she lived nearby and it was convenient, and in which Dorothy would have been equally fond of all three of them if they had all been equally available, and in which the letter and the trust represent a decision made by an elderly woman in a context of sustained influence rather than a decision made by a clear-eyed, careful woman who knew exactly what she was doing and why. This version allows Patrick to be comfortable. Margaret does not begrudge him the comfort. She simply does not share it. James has a quieter version, a version in which the whole thing was unfortunate and he is sad about it. And he does not quite know whose side he was supposed to be on, and he hopes that Margaret understands. Margaret does understand. She understands precisely. What she carries and what she will carry is not the money. The money is useful, and she is grateful for it in the practical way of someone who has been careful with limited resources her whole adult life and has now been relieved of that particular constraint. What she carries is the letter, the one page in Dorothy's cramped, arthritic handwriting that said, I am done staying quiet in order to keep the peace. 8 decades, 81 years of keeping the peace. And at the end of it, one page. Margaret thinks sometimes that this is the most human thing she has ever read. The combination of wisdom and delay, the truth that took a whole life to arrive at, delivered from the only position still available. She finds it, in turns, beautiful and heartbreaking, and something she intends to learn from, while she still has the time to act on it. Here is the question I want to leave you with, because every story I tell ends with a question that belongs to you rather than to me. When the people in your life finally choose honesty over accommodation, when they stop smoothing things over and say the actual thing, even at cost, even knowing it will be received badly by someone, are you prepared to receive it? Or are you the person who immediately reaches for the legal term, who finds the solicitor, who frames an uncomfortable truth as something to be contested and corrected, rather than something to be heard? Dorothy said it from the only position she had left, with the patience of a woman who had been preparing to say it for longer than anyone knew. The people who could not receive it probably never will. And Margaret, who sat in a house on Millfield Lane every Sunday for 11 years without once calculating what it would get her, received it in a sealed white envelope in a solicitor's office in Harrogate, and carries it still. The things people leave us are rarely the things we expected. The things that cost us are rarely the ones anyone warned us about. My name is Diana, and the family, what remained of it and what fell away, never wanted any of this told. Patrick has not called. The house belongs to someone else now. Dorothy's letter is inside a book on a nightstand in a semi-detached house in Yorkshire, where a district nurse reads a few pages before turning off her light and gets up the next morning and drives the blue Renault across the moors to sit with the people who need her. If you've lived something like this, you don't have to explain it to anyone. But if you want to, I'm here. I'm Diana,